Welcome to Cafe Tales. Today, we journey to the village of Nether Dene in the English countryside, where an elderly piano teacher sits dead at her instrument, fingers resting upon the keys as if caught in eternal performance. Stay with me until the very end, for this mystery reveals how ghostly melodies on telephone lines concealed a murder most ingenious. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoy these stories and the work I do here, please consider subscribing to the channel. You can also join our membership for ad-free videos and exclusive mysteries. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Reading your comments always brings me joy. Now settle in with a hot cup of coffee. Stay curious and let's get started. The Dead Don't Play. Piano. Chapter 1. An Invitation to Nether Dene. Miss Jane-Marple adjusted her light wool shawl as the train drew into the small country station of Nether Dene. Through the carriage window, she observed the familiar charm of an English village in early autumn, climbing roses still blooming against cottage walls, their petals beginning to show the first hints of seasonal fatigue, and the gentle undulation of the countryside beyond. "Aunt Jane!" came a cheerful voice as she stepped onto the platform. Raymond West, her nephew, approached with his customary brisk stride, followed by his wife Joan, whose pleasant face bore that particular expression of domestic contentment that Miss Marple had come to associate with successful marriages of some years' standing. "How delightful to see you both," Miss Marple said, accepting Raymond's kiss on her cheek. "What a charming station this is. One can always tell a great deal about a village from its railway station, I find." Joan laughed. "You'll find Nether Dene very much to your liking. I think it's exactly the sort of place where nothing ever happens." "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "In my experience, it is precisely in such places that the most interesting things occur. But perhaps I am being fanciful." As they walked toward Raymond's motor car, Miss Marple's keen blue eyes took in the details of the village street. The post office displayed a neat arrangement of local notices in its window. A woman in a brown coat was examining the contents of the baker's shop with the particular intensity that suggested she was weighing both quality and economy. Two elderly gentlemen stood outside the public house, their conversation animated by gestures toward the church spire. "The vicar is new," Joan explained, following her aunt's gaze. "Mr. Clement arrived only last month. The previous incumbent, poor Mr. Ashford, suffered from his heart." "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple. "And the parish has accepted the change?" "Well, oh yes," Joan replied, "though there was some discussion about the flower arrangements. You know how these matters can become rather heated among the ladies." Miss Marple nodded knowingly. She did indeed. Their destination proved to be a comfortable Georgian house set back from the main road, with a garden that spoke of careful tending and a genuine love of growing things. As they approached the front door, Miss Marple noticed that the neighboring properties were of similar vintage and upkeep, suggesting a community of established residents with sufficient means to maintain their homes properly. "You must tell me about your neighbors," Miss Marple said as Joan led her into a sitting room furnished with the sort of comfortable chintz and well-polished mahogany that indicated both good taste and careful housekeeping. "One learns so much about a place through its inhabitants." "Well," Joan began, settling herself with the natural grace of a practiced hostess, "there's Dr. Meadows, of course. He's been here for 30 years at least. His practice covers 3 villages, but he lives just around the corner. Then there's Colonel Bantry, no relation to your friend Dolly, I'm afraid, who retired here after India." "And any ladies of particular note?" Miss Marple inquired, accepting the offered cup of tea with appreciation. Joan's eyes brightened. "Oh yes, Miss Anthea Cummings. She's quite the most distinguished resident we have. A former concert pianist, you know. She studied at the Royal Academy and performed in London and on the continent before the war." Now she lives very quietly in Ivy Cottage and gives piano lessons to selected pupils. How interesting, Miss Marple observed. And does she perform locally? Very rarely. She's rather, well, one might say particular about such things. She maintains that standards in musical appreciation have declined considerably since her youth. Joan lowered her voice slightly. Between you and me, she can be somewhat formidable. The children who take lessons with her are rather in awe of her. Raymond, who had been arranging Miss Marple's small suitcase in the hallway, rejoined them. Joan's being diplomatic, aren't you, Jane? Miss Cummings is what the village politely calls a character. She has very definite opinions about most things and isn't hesitant to share them. She sounds perfectly fascinating, Miss Marple replied. I do hope I shall have the opportunity to meet her. I'm sure you will, Joan said. She takes her constitutional every morning at precisely 10, weather permitting. One could set one's clock by her movements. Miss Marple filed this information away with the particular attention she gave to all details concerning routine and habit. In her long experience, she had found that people's adherence to, or deviation from their established patterns often proved most illuminating. The remainder of the afternoon passed, pleasantly in gentle conversation about village affairs, the upcoming harvest festival, and the minor dramas that comprise the daily life of Nether Dene. As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself looking forward to her stay in this quiet corner of Surrey, where climbing roses adorned cottage walls, and nothing, as Joan had confidently declared, ever happened. She settled into her comfortable bed that night with the deep satisfaction that comes from a day well spent and the pleasant anticipation of discoveries yet to come. Chapter 2. The Music. Teacher of Nether Dene. Miss Marple emerged from the Georgian house the following morning to find Nether Dene bathed in the gentle golden light that so often graced English villages in early autumn. The air held that particular crispness that promised cooler days ahead, and she adjusted her cardigan accordingly as she set out for her customary morning walk. Her route took her naturally toward the village center, where she observed that Joan's prediction about Miss Cummings's punctuality appeared to hold true. At precisely 28 minutes past 10, a tall, erect figure emerged from a cottage almost entirely covered in ivy, its windows gleaming despite their partial concealment behind the trailing green leaves. Miss Anthea Cummings proved to be a woman of perhaps 70 years, with silver hair arranged in an elaborate style that suggested considerable attention to personal appearance. Her bearing was unmistakably that of one accustomed to command attention, and she walked with the measured pace of someone who expected the world to accommodate her schedule rather than the reverse. "Good morning," Miss Marple ventured pleasantly as their paths converged near the post office. Miss Cummings inclined her head, with the careful courtesy of one who acknowledged social obligations without necessarily encouraging further intimacy. "Good morning. You would be Mrs. West's aunt, I believe. Joan mentioned you might be visiting." "Indeed I am, Jane-Marple. I do hope my presence won't disturb the peaceful routine of your charming village." "Routine," Miss Cummings replied with a slight emphasis, "is essential to a well-ordered life. I have always maintained that precision in one's daily habits reflects precision of character." Before Miss Marple could respond, a cheerful voice called out from the post office doorway, "Miss Cummings, your music has arrived from London." The speaker was a stout, pleasant-faced woman, whom Miss Marple correctly assumed to be Mrs. Hartwell, the grocer's wife, whom Joan had mentioned. She approached them with the particular eagerness of one who delighted in being helpful. "How efficient of them," Miss Cummings observed. "I specifically requested delivery by the end of the week." "Oh, you needn't worry about that," Mrs. Hartwell continued with obvious admiration. "Everything always arrives exactly when you expect it to, doesn't it? I was saying to my husband just yesterday, you could set your watch by Miss Cummings's correspondence." publishers, music dealers, that sort of thing, all very prompt and professional. Miss Cummings accepted this tribute to her organizational abilities with dignified satisfaction, though Miss Marple detected a slight softening in her manner at the praise. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the postman, a thin, energetic man, who greeted Miss Cummings with the respect accorded to the village's most distinguished resident. More letters from those music publishers in London. "Miss Cummings," he announced, producing several envelopes from his bag. "Quite a correspondence you maintain with them." "Business matters," Miss Cummings replied crisply, though not unkindly. "There are certain musical manuscripts in my possession that have attracted scholarly interest. The Royal Music Archive, among others, has expressed considerable enthusiasm." Miss Marple filed this information away with her usual care. In her experience, valuable possessions often prove to be significant in unexpected ways. "How fascinating," she murmured. "You must have had a most distinguished career to have acquired such treasures." A flush of pleasure crossed Miss Cummings's austere features. "I was fortunate to study under some exceptional teachers. Master Kellner, in particular, entrusted me with certain of his unpublished works before his death. Few people today appreciate the true artistry of the classical tradition." At this moment, Dr. Meadows appeared from the direction of his surgery, a medical bag in one hand, and the slightly hurried expression of a country practitioner answering a call. He greeted the assembled ladies with professional courtesy. "Good morning, Miss Cummings. I trust you're keeping well. No return of those dizzy spells that troubled you in the spring?" "Nothing that a sensible diet and regular habits cannot address," she replied firmly. "I maintain that most ailments result from a failure to observe proper discipline in one's daily life." Dr. Meadows smiled with the patience of long experience. "Indeed, though I do recommend you continue to avoid overexertion. The heart, like any instrument, requires careful maintenance as the years advance." "My heart," Miss Cummings declared with some asperity, "is as sound as my piano technique. Both have been preserved through years of dedicated practice." After the doctor had departed on his rounds, Mrs. Hartwell leaned confidentially toward Miss Marple. "She's quite remarkable for her age, you know. Still gives lessons to young people from as far away as Guildford. Only last week that Mr. Traz came to visit her, you know, the famous pianist who writes those articles for the musical journals. He was one of her pupils years ago before he became so well known." Miss Cummings's expression grew notably warmer at this mention. Owen has remained properly appreciative of his early training. So few of the younger generation understand the importance of maintaining connections with their artistic origins. "He seemed quite devoted to you," Mrs. Hartwell continued. "Such a distinguished-looking gentleman and so attentive. He spent hours at Ivy Cottage discussing music and examining your collection of manuscripts." Miss Marple observed that this information appeared to give Miss Cummings considerable satisfaction, though she maintained her characteristic reserve in acknowledging it. The morning's encounters concluded with Miss Cummings's dignified departure for the remainder of her constitutional, leaving Miss Marple with a clear impression of a woman whose life was governed by precision, routine, and considerable pride in her musical heritage. She returned to Joan's house with her mind pleasantly occupied by these observations, reflecting on the various threads of information she had gathered about Nether Dene's most distinguished resident. The village seemed to regard Miss Cummings with that mixture of respect and slight weariness that communities often reserved for their more formidable members, and Miss Marple found herself looking forward to learning more about this interesting woman during the course of her stay. Chapter: Mysterious Melodies. The Sunday evening meal at the West. Household had concluded with Joan's excellent apple tart, and Miss Marple was settling into her customary post-dinner knitting when the telephone in the hallway began to ring. The sound carried clearly through the comfortable sitting room, and Raymond rose with the mild irritation of a man whose digestive peace had been disturbed. "Rather late for telephone calls," he muttered. Glancing at the mantelpiece clock, which showed 10 minutes past 9, his voice could be heard from the hallway, first questioning, then puzzled. "Hello, hello?" There was a lengthy pause followed by an exclamation of bewilderment. Most extraordinary thing. When he returned to the sitting room, his expression bore that particular confusion reserved for encounters with the genuinely inexplicable. "The oddest call," he announced to his wife and aunt. Someone rang from Miss Cummings's number, but there was no voice, only music. Piano music played very slowly and rather hauntingly. Then the line went dead. Joan looked up from her embroidery with mild interest. Perhaps she meant to give someone a private recital over the telephone, though it does seem rather an unusual way to share one's music. "It was beautiful in its way," Raymond continued, "but rather ghostly, if I may put it so. A waltz of some sort, played with considerable feeling, but very deliberately, as if each note were being carefully considered." Miss Marple's needles paused in their steady rhythm. "How very curious. You are quite certain the call originated from Miss Cummings's number?" The operator confirmed it when I inquired. "Most peculiar behavior, even for someone of her particular nature." The mystery deepened when Joan encountered Mrs. Hartwell the following morning at the baker's shop. The grocer's wife appeared both excited and somewhat unsettled, clutching her shopping basket with unusual force as she related her own experience. "Such a strange thing happened last evening," she confided to Joan, who had stopped to purchase fresh bread. "My telephone rang at exactly 9 o'clock. I remember because I was just settling down to listen to the wireless program, and when I answered, there was no voice, only piano music." Joan's eyebrows rose with interest. "Piano music, you say?" "The most haunting melody, played very slowly and mysteriously. I kept saying, 'Hello, hello.' But there was no response, and only this ghostly waltz continuing for perhaps 2 or 3 minutes before the line went silent." Mrs. Hartwell leaned closer confidentially. "I'm quite certain it came from Miss Cummings's cottage." The operator confirmed the number when I rang back to inquire. "How very odd," Joan murmured, remembering Raymond's similar experience. "Indeed it was. And what makes it even stranger, I happened to mention it to Mrs. Peaton from Elm Tree Cottage, and she received exactly the same sort of call at the same time. Piano music, no voice, from Miss Cummings's number." By the time Joan returned home with these revelations, Miss Marple's expression had taken on that quality of alert interest which her nephew had learned to recognize as significant. "2 more households, you say?" Miss Marple inquired thoughtfully. "All at approximately 9 o'clock, all featuring piano music rather than conversation?" Mrs. Hartwell seemed quite certain of the details, Joan confirmed, and she mentioned that Mrs. Peaton had an identical experience. During their afternoon walk, Miss Marple and Joan encountered Colonel Bantry near the church, where he was examining the notice board with the particular attention of a man seeking distraction from domestic routine. Upon learning of their interest in the previous evening's mysterious telephone calls, he revealed that he too had been a recipient. "Dashed peculiar thing," he announced with military directness. "Telephone rings at precisely 9 o'clock. I noted the time particularly because I was expecting a call from my nephew in London, and instead of conversation, there's this eerie piano music floating down the line." "The same waltz that the others described?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Exactly the same, I should think. Played very deliberately with considerable feeling, but rather ghostly in effect. Quite beautiful in its way, though decidedly unusual as a form of communication." "And you verified the source of the call?" "Naturally, I rang the operator immediately afterward, and she confirmed it had originated from Miss Cummings's cottage." Most irregular behavior, even for an artistic temperament. As they continued their walk, Miss Marple found herself turning over these curious facts in her mind. 4 separate households, all receiving identical calls at the same time, all featuring piano music instead of conversation, all confirmed as originating from Miss Cummings's residence. "It reminds me, rather," she said to Joan as they paused to admire a particularly fine display of late roses, "of something that happened in St-Mary-Mead some years ago. Old Mr. Petherick, who was quite devoted to his garden, began making unusual telephone calls to his neighbors just before—" She trailed off thoughtfully. "Before what, Aunt Jane?" "Before he died, my dear. Though in his case, the calls were perfectly ordinary in nature. He simply wanted to ensure his prized chrysanthemums would be properly cared for after his passing." Joan shivered slightly despite the warmth of the afternoon. What a morbid thought. Surely Miss Cummings was simply sharing her music in an unconventional manner. "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed mildly, though her tone suggested she found this explanation less than entirely satisfactory. That evening, as she sat with her knitting in the comfortable sitting room, Miss Marple found her mind returning repeatedly to the mystery of the musical telephone calls. In her long experience of village life, she had learned that when several people reported identical, unusual experiences, the explanation, when it eventually emerged, often proved to be both simpler and more complex than initial appearances might suggest. The haunting melody described by the recipients lingered in her thoughts as she prepared for bed, and she found herself wondering what message, if any, Miss Cummings had intended to convey through her ghostly, nocturnal concerts. Chapter 4. Death at the Piano. Monday morning dawned gray and subdued, with heavy clouds suggesting the approach of autumn rain. Miss Marple had risen early and was enjoying her customary cup of tea when the tranquil atmosphere of Nether Dene was shattered by the sound of urgent knocking at the West family's front door. Raymond, still in his dressing gown, opened it to find Mrs. Beddoes, Miss Cummings's housekeeper, standing on the threshold in a state of considerable distress. The woman's usually neat gray hair had escaped its pins, and her face bore the particular pallor that accompanies profound shock. "Oh, Mr. West, sir," she gasped, clutching her shawl with trembling hands. "Such a terrible thing. I hardly know what to do. It's Miss Cummings, sir. She's gone." "Gone?" Joan appeared at Raymond's shoulder, immediately alert to the gravity of the situation. "What do you mean, Mrs. Beddoes? Please come in and sit down." The housekeeper allowed herself to be led into the sitting room, where Miss Marple had already set aside her knitting in preparation to offer whatever comfort might be required. Mrs. Beddoes sank into the offered chair, her composure beginning to crumble. "Dead, ma'am," she whispered. "Found her this morning when I came to prepare breakfast, just as I have every morning these past 15 years. She was sitting at her piano, hands resting on the keys, as peaceful as you please." But her voice broke entirely. "Take your time, Mrs. Beddoes," Miss Marple said gently. "Perhaps a cup of tea would help." While Joan busied herself with the tea things, Mrs. Beddoes gradually composed herself sufficiently to provide the essential details. She had arrived at Ivy Cottage at her usual time of 8, let herself in with her own key, and proceeded to the music room to open the curtains, as was her custom. There she sat, the housekeeper continued, accepting the offered cup with grateful hands. Dressed in her good gray dress, the one she wore for receiving visitors, with her fingers just touching the piano keys. The candle on the music stand had burned very low, almost to nothing, and there was sheet music open, something I hadn't seen before. "What sort of music?" Miss Marple inquired with gentle interest. "A waltz, ma'am, with foreign words written at the top. Molto misterioso," it said, in Miss Cummings's own handwriting. Very delicate and mysterious looking, if I may say so. Raymond had dressed hurriedly and departed to summon Dr. Meadows, leaving the ladies to comfort the distressed housekeeper. When the doctor arrived some 20 minutes later, his professional demeanor could not entirely conceal his own surprise at the unexpected call. Natural causes. "I should expect," he announced upon his return from examining the deceased. "Heart failure, which is not uncommon in a woman of her age. Though I must say these circumstances are rather unusual." "In what way, doctor?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Dr. Meadows removed his spectacles and cleaned them with the careful deliberation of a man organizing his thoughts. "Well, for one thing, the candle beside her had burned almost completely down, suggesting she had been sitting there for some considerable time. And there was a faint scent in the room, almonds, I believe, though that might simply be her customary perfume." Joan looked puzzled. "Almonds? Miss Cummings always wore a particular fragrance," Mrs. Beddoes explained. "Made with bitter almond oil, specially ordered from London. She said it reminded her of her performing days on the continent." "Quite so," Dr. Meadows agreed, though the scent seemed rather stronger than usual. "However, there's nothing necessarily significant in that." The doctor's official pronouncement brought a measure of closure to the immediate shock. But Miss Marple found herself troubled by certain aspects of the scene, as described. The positioning seemed almost theatrical in its perfection, too artfully arranged for the random moment of natural death. Had Miss Cummings been unwell recently? She inquired of Mrs. Beddoes. "No more than usual, ma'am. She complained of the occasional dizzy spell, as the doctor knows, but nothing that prevented her from maintaining her regular routine. She gave a lesson to young Master Peaton on Saturday afternoon and seemed in perfectly normal spirits." "And yesterday evening, did she seem unusually tired or distressed?" Mrs. Beddoes considered this carefully. "I wouldn't know about the evening, ma'am. I don't work Sundays, you see, but she was quite herself when I left Saturday after preparing her tea." The implications of this began to settle over the assembled group. If Mrs. Beddoes had not been present on Sunday evening, then who, if anyone, had witnessed Miss Cummings's final hours? And more puzzling still, who had been responsible for the mysterious piano calls that had so disturbed the village? Dr. Meadows cleared his throat. "I shall need to contact the coroner, naturally, though I expect the formalities will be straightforward. Death by natural causes, though the exact time will require some consideration." "What do you estimate, doctor?" Raymond asked. Difficult to say with precision. The body showed signs consistent with death having occurred some hours before discovery, perhaps late yesterday evening, though I cannot be more specific without further examination. Miss Marple absorbed this information with particular interest. If Miss Cummings had died in the early evening, as the doctor suggested, then the piano calls received by various villagers at 9 o'clock presented a most intriguing puzzle. Either the doctor's estimation was incorrect, or something very unusual indeed had occurred at Ivy Cottage the previous evening. As the morning progressed and the necessary arrangements were set in motion, Miss Marple found her mind returning repeatedly to the image Mrs. Beddoes had painted. The elderly piano teacher seated at her instrument in the gray morning light, surrounded by the lingering scent of almonds and the remnants of a candle that had burned through the long night hours. The peaceful scene, she reflected, possessed an almost artistic quality that seemed somehow at odds with the random nature of natural death. In her experience, reality rarely arranged itself with such dramatic precision unless human agency had played a role in the arrangement. Chapter 5. Small. Inconsistencies. The afternoon brought a steady drizzle that seemed to match the subdued mood that had settled over Nether Dene. Miss Marple, accompanied by Joan, made her way along the village lane toward Ivy Cottage, ostensibly to pay her respects and offer whatever assistance might be required during this difficult time. Mrs. Beddoes, still pale but considerably more composed than she had been that morning, admitted them with the grateful expression of one who welcomed any distraction from solitary grief. The cottage itself proved to be exactly as Miss Marple had imagined, a perfect example of artistic sensibility combined with comfortable living, though now bearing the unmistakable atmosphere of a house touched by death. "So kind of you to come," Mrs. Beddoes murmured, leading them through a hallway lined with framed programs from Miss Cummings's performing days. "I confess I hardly know what to do with myself. After 15 years of regular routine, the silence seems quite overwhelming." The music room, where Miss Cummings had been discovered, retained an air of recent disturbance, despite Dr. Meadows's careful restoration of order. Miss Marple's observant eyes took in the details of the scene with the particular attention she had learned to apply to any environment where unexpected death had occurred. The piano itself was a handsome rosewood upright, its surface polished to mirror brightness. The bench was positioned at a distance that struck Miss Marple as slightly awkward, not quite close enough for comfortable playing, yet not far enough away to suggest someone had simply been admiring the instrument. "Mrs. Beddoes," she said gently, "I hope you won't think me impertinent, but was this exactly how you found Miss Cummings this morning? The position of the bench, I mean." The housekeeper considered the question with the care it deserved. "Well, ma'am, the doctor did move about somewhat during his examination. But yes, I believe the bench was positioned much as you see it now. Perhaps pulled back just slightly from where one would, normally sit to play." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, and moved to examine the piano's music stand, where the mysterious waltz still rested. The manuscript was written in Miss Cummings's characteristic precise hand, with molto misterioso inscribed at the top in elegant script. "A composition of her own?" Joan inquired. "I believe so, ma'am," Mrs. Beddoes replied, "though I must say I hadn't seen it before yesterday." Miss Cummings was always very particular about her music, every piece in its proper place, every manuscript carefully filed. This appeared to be something quite new. As they moved about the room, Miss Marple's attention was caught by several small details that seemed somehow inconsistent with the scene of peaceful death that had initially been described. The piano lid, for instance, gleamed with a freshness that suggested recent cleaning, unusual for an instrument that, according to Mrs. Beddoes, had been played the evening before. Near the window, a small side table held a tea tray bearing 2 saucers, but only 1 cup, the china showing faint stains that indicated recent use. Miss Marple found this arrangement puzzling, though she forbore to comment directly upon it. "Miss Cummings entertained a visitor recently?" she asked with casual interest. "Not that I'm aware of, ma'am, though. Of course, I wouldn't know about Sunday, having had the day off. She did mention that Mr. Traz, her former pupil, had called last week, but that was several days ago." At that moment, as if summoned by the mention of his name, Owen Traz himself appeared at the cottage door. Mrs. Beddoes admitted him with the deference due to Miss Cummings's most distinguished former student, and he entered the music room with the bearing of one deeply affected by loss. Traz proved to be a man of perhaps 45 years, with the long fingers of a pianist and the slightly theatrical manner that Miss Marple had learned to associate with those who lived their lives in the public eye. His grief appeared genuine, though expressed with a dramatic intensity that seemed almost rehearsed. "I came as soon as I heard," he announced, his voice carrying the trained projection of a performer. "To think that dear Anthea should be taken so suddenly, so unexpectedly. Only last week we were discussing her future plans, her hopes for preserving the musical treasures she had collected over the years." "You visited her recently?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Indeed, I make a point of calling upon her whenever my concert schedule permits. She was not merely my teacher, you understand, but a connection to the great musical traditions of the past. Her collection of manuscripts, her insights into the classical repertoire, irreplaceable, absolutely irreplaceable." Joan glanced at Miss Marple with raised eyebrows. She possessed valuable manuscripts? Oh, yes, Traz replied with considerable enthusiasm. Works by Master Kellner, unpublished compositions of extraordinary beauty and complexity. Anthea had been considering their eventual donation to the Royal Music Archive, though she was naturally reluctant to part with them during her lifetime. Mrs. Beddoes nodded confirmation. She spent considerable time recently corresponding with various institutions about those manuscripts, always very secretive about them, though kept them locked away in her study upstairs. Miss Marple absorbed this information while continuing her careful observation of the room. The gas heater, she noticed, had been turned completely off. Despite the chill in the air, an unusual economy for someone who had been sitting alone in the evening hours. Mr. Traz, she said thoughtfully, when you visited Miss Cummings last week, did she seem in good health? Good spirits, he replied. Remarkably so, considering her age. We spent several hours discussing music, examining some of her treasures. I left her on... He paused as if calculating. It would have been Tuesday midday, I believe. She seemed perfectly well then, though she did mention occasional dizzy spells. You didn't return to the village after Tuesday? Miss Marple's question was posed with such gentle interest that it seemed merely conversational. Certainly not. My schedule took me directly back to London, where I had several appointments. I only learned of dear Anthea's death this morning when a mutual acquaintance telephoned with the devastating news. As they prepared to take their leave, Miss Marple found herself mentally cataloging the various small inconsistencies she had observed. The oddly positioned piano bench, the freshly cleaned instrument, the 2 saucers with 1 teacup, the turned-off heater, and now the question of valuable manuscripts that had apparently occupied much of Miss Cummings's recent attention. Each detail might possess an innocent explanation, yet taken together, they suggested a picture somewhat more complex than the simple death by natural causes that Dr. Meadows had initially diagnosed. In her long experience of human nature and its infinite capacity for deception, Miss Marple had learned to pay particular attention to scenes that appeared almost too perfectly arranged, and the music room at Ivy Cottage was beginning to strike her as exactly such a scene. Chapter 6. The Missing Manuscripts. The following morning brought Mr. Wickham, Miss Cummings's solicitor, to Nether Dene with the particular gravity that accompanies the reading of a last will and testament. He had arranged to meet with Mrs. Beddoes and the other interested parties in the sitting room of Ivy Cottage, where the morning light fell softly through windows that would no longer frame their former owner's precise movements. Miss Marple and Joan had been invited to attend, partly out of courtesy to visitors who had shown such kindness during the village's time of grief, and partly because Mrs. Beddoes had expressed a desire for their moral support during what she anticipated would be an emotional proceeding. Mr. Wickham proved to be a thin, precise gentleman of advancing years whose manner suggested long familiarity with the solemnities of his profession. He adjusted his spectacles with careful deliberation before beginning to read from the document that would determine the final disposition of Miss Cummings's earthly possessions. The will itself contained few surprises in its initial provisions. Mrs. Beddoes was to receive a generous pension and several personal mementos in recognition of her years of faithful service. Various small bequests were made to local charities and the church. The cottage and its furnishings were left to a distant cousin in Scotland. It was the final bequest, however, that commanded the particular attention of all present. To the Royal Music Archive, Mr. Wickham read in his measured tones, I leave my complete collection of unpublished musical manuscripts by Master Heinrich Kellner, together with my own compositional works and correspondence relating thereto, in the hope that these materials will be preserved for the benefit of future musical scholars. The solicitor paused to remove his spectacles and clean them with methodical care. The manuscripts in question represent a collection of considerable value, both artistic and monetary. Miss Cummings had them appraised only last month, and their estimated worth exceeds $20,000. A murmur of surprise rippled through the small gathering, even allowing for Miss Cummings's distinguished musical background. Few had suspected she possessed items of such extraordinary value. "Where are these manuscripts presently located?" Owen Traz inquired, his voice carrying a note of professional interest that seemed perfectly natural under the circumstances. Mr. Wickham consulted his papers with thoroughness that characterized all his actions. According to Miss Cummings's instructions, they were kept in the locked cabinet in her study upstairs. She provided me with a detailed inventory only 3 weeks ago, along with copies of the appraisal documents. Mrs. Beddoes shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I'm afraid I've never been permitted access to that particular cabinet, sir." Miss Cummings was most particular about her private papers and manuscripts. She always kept the key herself. "Quite proper," Mr. Wickham agreed. "However, I shall need to examine the collection before arranging its transfer to the archive. Perhaps we might attend to that matter now." The small procession that made its way upstairs to Miss Cummings's study had the solemnity of a funeral cortege. The room itself reflected its owner's methodical nature, every book properly shelved, every paper neatly filed, every surface free of the casual clutter that accumulates in most private spaces. The cabinet that housed the precious manuscripts stood against the far wall, its dark wood gleaming with the care that Mrs. Beddoes had lavished upon every piece of furniture in the cottage. Mr. Wickham produced a small key from his professional case and inserted it into the lock with the satisfaction of a man completing a well-ordered procedure. The lock turned easily, the doors swung open, and Mr. Wickham's expression of professional competence gave way to one of profound bewilderment. The cabinet was empty. "I don't understand," he said, his voice rising slightly above its customary measured tones. "The manuscripts should be here, arranged according to Miss Cummings's careful system of organization." Mrs. Beddoes peered into the vacant interior with genuine astonishment. "They were certainly there last week, sir. I remember dusting around the cabinet, and Miss specifically reminded me not to disturb the contents." Owen Traz stepped forward, his face bearing an expression of artistic anguish that seemed entirely appropriate to the discovery of such a cultural loss. £20,000 worth of irreplaceable musical heritage, he said quietly. Gone without a trace. Miss Marple, who had been observing the scene with her characteristic attention to detail, noticed that the cabinet showed no signs of forced entry. The lock had functioned perfectly. The wood around it bore no scratches or other marks of violence, and the interior, though empty, was clean and undisturbed. "Mr. Wickham," she said gently, "might I ask who else possessed a key to this cabinet?" The solicitor considered the question with professional care. "As far as I'm aware, Miss Cummings kept the only key. She was most insistent upon maintaining complete control over access to her valuable manuscripts." "And when did you last personally verify their presence?" 3 weeks ago, when she prepared the inventory for her will. Everything was precisely as she had described, meticulously organized and carefully preserved. Joan looked puzzled. But surely someone must have known of their location and value. Such things don't simply vanish into thin air. "Indeed not," Miss Marple agreed quietly. Her mind was already turning over the implications of this discovery. The manuscripts had disappeared sometime between Mr. Wickham's last visit 3 weeks ago and the reading of the will this morning. Given Miss Cummings's careful habits and protective attitude toward her treasures, their removal suggested either her deliberate action or that of someone who possessed both her complete trust and detailed knowledge of the collection's significance. The group returned to the sitting room in subdued silence. each absorbed in contemplating the mystery of the vanished manuscripts. Mr. Wickham, clearly distressed by this unprecedented situation, announced his intention to contact the police immediately. "Though I confess," he said, gathering his papers with less than his usual precision, "I cannot imagine how anyone could have gained access to those manuscripts without Miss Cummings's knowledge and cooperation." As the solicitor departed to make his official report, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious timing of the manuscript's disappearance. In her experience, valuable objects rarely vanished by coincidence so close to their owner's death, and the connection between Miss Cummings's sudden demise and the theft of her most precious possessions seemed too significant to ignore. The mystery of Nether Dene had deepened considerably, and she suspected that the gentle piano teacher's death was far more complex than anyone had initially imagined. Chapter 7: The Player Piano's Secret. The police constable who arrived from the county headquarters proved to be an earnest young man named Hartley, whose determination to handle his first significant case properly was evident in his methodical approach to interviewing the household. Miss Marple observed his proceedings with the benevolent interest she always took in conscientious young people attempting to master their professions. After Constable Hartley had completed his initial examination of the empty manuscript cabinet and recorded the relevant details, Miss Marple approached him with the diffident manner she had perfected for dealing with official authority. "I do hope you won't think me presumptuous, Constable," she began gently, "but I've been rather puzzled by those mysterious telephone calls that occurred on Sunday evening." "You know about them, I presume?" "Indeed I do, ma'am. Most peculiar circumstances, though I'm not entirely certain of their relevance to the theft of the manuscripts." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple agreed. "But it occurs to me that the timing might be significant. If Miss Cummings died in the early evening, as Dr. Meadows suggested, then who was playing the piano at 9 o'clock when those calls were made?" Constable Hartley's expression grew more attentive. "An excellent point, ma'am. I confess I hadn't fully considered the implications." "It reminds me," Miss Marple continued thoughtfully, "of something from my younger days. My dear father was fascinated by mechanical inventions, and I remember him showing me a player piano at a country house we visited. Such ingenious devices. They could be set to play music at predetermined times through the use of perforated rolls and clockwork mechanisms." The constable looked increasingly interested. "You think Miss Cummings might have possessed such a device?" "It's merely a thought," Miss Marple replied modestly. "But perhaps it might be worth examining her piano more closely. With your permission, of course, and that of someone with proper technical knowledge." This suggestion led to the summoning of Mr. Dobson, the village's piano tuner, a thin, scholarly gentleman who had maintained Miss Cummings's instrument for the better part of 2 decades. His arrival at Ivy Cottage an hour later brought with it the particular authority that comes from intimate knowledge of one's craft. "A player mechanism?" he mused when Constable Hartley explained their inquiry. "Well, it's certainly possible. Miss Cummings's piano is quite old enough to have been fitted with such a device originally. Many fine instruments of that vintage were so equipped. Mr. Dobson's examination of the rosewood upright proved both methodical and revealing. He began by removing the front panel, exposing the piano's internal mechanism to detailed scrutiny. What he discovered there caused him to emit a small exclamation of surprise. "Most extraordinary," he announced, his professional composure momentarily forgotten. "There is indeed a player mechanism here, though it's been disconnected for many years. However," he paused to examine something more closely, "it appears to have been recently restored to working condition." Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "Recently, you say?" "Within the last few weeks, I should judge." The mechanical components show signs of fresh lubrication and adjustment. Someone with considerable technical skill has restored this device to full functionality. Joan, who had been following these developments with growing fascination, looked puzzled. "But surely Miss Cummings would have mentioned such work to you, Mr. Dobson. You've been her regular tuner for years." "Indeed she would have," the piano tuner confirmed. "I service this instrument quarterly, and she always consulted me about any repairs or modifications. She certainly didn't authorize this work through me." Constable Hartley made careful notes as Mr. Dobson continued his examination. The player mechanism, though old, had been expertly restored and was fully capable of playing predetermined musical selections at set times. More significantly, it could be wound and programmed to activate hours after the setting had been made. "The key insight," Mr. Dobson explained, "is that this mechanism operates entirely independently of human presence. Once properly wound and set, it would play its programmed selection at the designated time, regardless of whether anyone was present in the room." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And if one were to leave a telephone receiver near the piano, the music would certainly be transmitted to anyone listening on the other end of the line," the piano tuner confirmed. As Mr. Dobson completed his examination, he made one final discovery that proved particularly significant. Wedged beneath the piano's fallboard, almost invisible unless one knew where to look, was a small piece of paper bearing musical notations and what appeared to be timing calculations. The handwriting, when compared to samples of Miss Cummings's correspondence, proved to be distinctly different. More hurried and less precise than her characteristic. Careful script. Constable Hartley examined the paper with growing interest. These appear to be instructions for setting the player mechanism. The timing calculations correspond almost exactly to 9 o'clock Sunday evening. "Most illuminating," Miss Marple observed quietly. "It would seem that someone with detailed knowledge of both the piano's hidden mechanism and Miss Cummings's habits took considerable trouble to create the illusion that she was alive hours after her actual death." Joan looked troubled. "But who would have possessed such knowledge? And more importantly, why would anyone go to such elaborate lengths?" "As to the first question," Miss Marple replied gently, "we must consider who had both the technical expertise and the opportunity to restore that mechanism without Miss Cummings's knowledge. As to the second," she paused meaningfully, "the creation of a false timeline suggests that the truth about Miss Cummings's death would reveal something that someone was very anxious to conceal." The implications of these discoveries settled over the small group like a cloud passing across the sun. The mysterious telephone calls, which had initially seemed merely eccentric, now appeared as evidence of calculated deception. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to suggest that Miss Cummings was alive and playing her piano at 9 o'clock Sunday evening, when in all probability she had died much earlier. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the music room, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the ingenious but ultimately flawed nature of the deception they had uncovered. The perpetrator had demonstrated considerable technical skill and intimate knowledge of Miss Cummings's habits, yet had failed to account for the thorough investigation that would inevitably follow the discovery of the missing manuscripts. In her long experience of human nature, she had observed that the most elaborate schemes often contained within them the seeds of their own destruction, and she suspected that the mysterious player piano mechanism would prove to be precisely such a case. Chapter 8. L'adieu. The gathering that assembled in the music room of Ivy Cottage the following afternoon possessed all the solemnity of a final curtain. Constable Hartley had arranged for the principal figures in the case to be present, ostensibly to review the evidence concerning the missing manuscripts, though Miss Marple suspected the young officer had begun to appreciate the deeper significance of recent discoveries. Owen Traz arrived punctually at 3 o'clock, his manner bearing that particular gravity appropriate to discussing the loss of irreplaceable cultural treasures. Dr. Meadows attended in his professional capacity, having been asked to clarify certain medical aspects of Miss Cummings's death. Mrs. Beddoes sat quietly in her accustomed chair, still pale but determined to see justice done for her departed employer. "Before we proceed," Miss Marple said gently to Constable Hartley, "might I ask whether you've had the opportunity to verify Mr. Traz's movements on Sunday evening?" The constable consulted his notebook with official precision. "I've made inquiries at the local inn, ma'am. Several guests reported seeing Mr. Traz's motor car in the village that evening, contrary to his statement about departing on Tuesday midday." Traz's composure wavered slightly, though he maintained his dignified bearing. "I may have been mistaken about the exact timing of my departure. The shock of dear Anthea's death has naturally affected my memory of recent events." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed sympathetically. "Such confusion is perfectly understandable. But I wonder if you might help us with another small puzzle, the restoration of the player piano mechanism. Such work would require considerable technical expertise." "I know nothing about any player piano," Traz replied, though his voice carried less conviction than his words. Suggested Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew a small piece of paper, the fragment Mr. Dobson had discovered beneath the piano's fallboard. The handwriting on these timing calculations is quite distinctive. Perhaps you might recognize it?" Dr. Meadows leaned forward to examine the paper with professional interest. "This appears to be musical notation combined with precise time calculations, the work of someone with considerable knowledge of both music and mechanical devices." "Indeed," Miss Marple continued quietly. "Someone who understood that Miss Cummings's death must appear to have occurred later than it actually did. Someone who knew about the valuable manuscripts and saw an opportunity too tempting to resist." Traz's theatrical composure began to crumble under the weight of accumulated evidence. His hands, those long pianist's fingers that had once commanded concert hall audiences, trembled slightly as he reached for his handkerchief. "The bitter almond oil," Miss Marple continued with gentle relentlessness, "was a particularly clever choice. Miss Cummings's own perfume would mask the scent of the poison, at least initially. And positioning her at the piano, with that haunting waltz as her final piece, L'Adieu, wasn't it? Created such a romantic tableau." "You don't understand," Traz said suddenly, his voice breaking with emotion. "My career was finished. The critics had turned against me. The concert bookings had dried up. Those manuscripts represented my only chance to reclaim my reputation, to be remembered for something more than faded glory." Constable Hartley looked up from his careful note-taking. "Are you confessing to the murder of Miss Cummings, sir?" "Murder is such a harsh word," Traz replied weakly. "I simply helped her toward an end that was inevitable, given her age and health. The bitter almond compound was painless. She simply grew drowsy and slipped away while I played for her one last time." Mrs. Beddoes drew in a sharp breath, her face reflecting both shock and profound sadness at this revelation. "And the manuscripts?" Dr. Meadows asked quietly. "Safe," Traz assured him with a return of his former pride. "I would never have destroyed such cultural treasures. I merely intended to rediscover them after a suitable interval to present them to the world as Owen Traz's contribution to musical scholarship." Miss Marple nodded with the satisfaction of a puzzle finally completed. "But you made one crucial error, Mr. Traz. The player piano mechanism, ingenious as it was, required you to remain in the village to set it in motion. Had you truly departed on Tuesday, as you claimed, you could never have programmed it to create your alibi." "The waltz itself was the final clue," she continued gently. "L'Adieu, the farewell. Miss Cummings composed it for you years ago, didn't she? A piece that meant something special to both teacher and pupil. You couldn't resist using it as her swan song, even though it tied you directly to the crime. As Constable Hartley formally placed Owen Traz under arrest, the former concert pianist seemed to shrink within his elegant clothes, the weight of his actions finally settling upon his shoulders like a heavy cloak. She was so proud of those manuscripts, Mrs. Beddoes whispered, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. They represented everything she had worked to preserve for future generations. Miss Marple approached the piano and gently closed the lid, her movements reflecting the respect due to an instrument that had witnessed both beautiful music and terrible deception. The late afternoon light filtered through the cottage windows, casting long shadows across the room where Miss Anthea Cummings had spent her final moments. "How strange," she observed to Joan, as they prepared to leave Ivy Cottage for the last time, that the same fingers which once brought such joy through music should have been used to steal both life and art. In the end, Mr. Traz's greatest performance was his most dishonest one, and like all false notes, it could not long escape detection. The music room fell silent as the last witnesses to the tragedy departed, leaving only the ghostly echoes of a waltz that would forever be remembered, not for its beauty, but for its role in revealing the dark heart of murder, disguised as devotion. And so our tale concludes in the music room of Ivy Cottage, where Miss Marple has once again proven that no deception, however cleverly orchestrated, can escape the keen observation of human nature and village wisdom. The ghostly piano melodies have been revealed not as supernatural phenomena, but as the mechanical creation of desperate ambition and artistic knowledge turned to murderous purpose. What did you think of this mystery? Were you able to solve it alongside the brilliant Miss Marple? Let me know in the comments below. I love hearing your thoughts and theories about these mysteries. If you enjoyed this episode, please give this video a like and subscribe for more detective stories. Your support helps me continue bringing these mysteries to life. Until next time. Keep your wits sharp, your curiosity keen, and remember, in the world of Miss Marple, the quietest villages often hide the darkest secrets. This is Ailey signing off from Cafe Tales.